afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I've been invited to give you a rapid introduction to farmsteads in their historic landscapes. And I think we've spoken quite a lot throughout the course of today's seminar about the setting of farmsteads and their relationship with their wider landscape. So I'm going to try in the next 20 minutes to give you just a very rapid introduction to an approach that I've been involved with over the last 12, 13 years, where we've gone in parallel with farmstead characterization, and that is landscape characterization. Which is the button? Right, I think we've fairly well established today that farmsteads don't sit in isolation in the landscape, but that they are very intimately related with the surrounding fields, woods, parkland, etc. And I think the comment this morning about them being the full stops, the exclamation marks, is quite true. They are the centre from where the surrounding land was organised and managed. And many farms today have actually lost that management relationship. I think, as Jeremy said, they've been decoupled from the land. And with their connection with their fields. But their actual physical relationship, the fact that they're still sitting amongst their historic landscape, that may be modified through modern land use, there still is that physical connection. Understanding what that wider historic landscape is all about can be seen and looked at through using what's called historic landscape characterization. Now, Kent was one of the first counties to have a historic landscape characterisation process take part across the county. It's part of a much wider project that English Heritage have been involved with and since about 1991, and it's nearing its completion now. Farmstead characterisation evolved out of it, as also seascape characterisation. So just a brief introduction to it. It's an observational approach to the actual surface of the present landscape to understand its predominant historic character. So we've been talking about the Weald being a small, intimate landscape with wooded hedges, compared with, say, the Downs with a much wider 18th century regular farmstead. That's sort of a very basic approach to the summary of characterisation. And you can also use present-day historic character, to characterise the past landscapes of what's happened through the past, how landscapes have changed in the past, to establish time depth. And you'll hear two terms: time depth, which looks at the different layers of change that have happened through a landscape, and antiquity. The High Weald landscape is a landscape of high antiquity, because it has a lot of its medieval origins surviving through to the present day. An area like Kent Downs is a landscape which has quite a lot of time depth because there's been quite a lot of change that's taken place. HLC identifies units of land based on key historic attributes using selected historic sources. Now, we've talked a lot about some of the historic sources today, the OS maps, the Tithe maps, and the Ordnance Surveyor's draft drawings. So HLC draws on a lot of those resources plus other data as well. And HLC recognises that landscape is a matter of both perception, how we perceive it, how we view it, as well as fact, the information that tells us as to how that landscape has come about. And it's underpinned by the European Landscape Convention's definition of landscape, that it's an area perceived by people whose character is the result of action and interaction of natural and or human factors. So the Kent HLC was one of the early ones, and it was completed in 2001, and it underpins the County Historic Environment Record. So it forms the layer underneath the very site-based environment record. And it's a very much broad brush approach to characterisation, and as the methodology evolved in line with as GIS technology developed, later counties became more detailed. I wasn't involved with the Kent first one, but I was involved, or did undertake the Sussex HLC, which is one of the most detailed HLCs that we have. We've then been looking the high Weald to look at actually revising the Kent HLC, to actually look at it in a bit more detail with some extra data sources. And a number of pilot areas have been looked at, one of which was the Who Peninsula in Kent, as part of the English Heritage Who's Historic Landscape Project. And then, using that same methodology, we've then been using it at the High Weald. And as you know, the High Weald straddles both Kent and Sussex. So in order for its, the HLC for the High Weald to be more systematic across the whole of the area, we've been looking at trying to update some of the Kent parishes in line with the Sussex ones. This is very much work in progress, ongoing, and we've undertaken 3 pilot parishes, Scoudhurst, Cranbrook and Hawkhurst. Firstly, to bring it in line with the Sussex HLC, to help aid in the High Weald's management plan revision, and to also help provide evidence base for managing land use change, both existing and potential land use change within the Weald. So the objectives, as I say, were to undertake a revision of the Phase 1, the 2001 HLC, using a similar methodology for the Heritage, the Peninsula, a report of which is now being published. And using selected analysis of the data to look at the breadth and depth of the revision regarding the detail that we've looked at, to provide a detailed topological gazetteer for the High Weald for the Phase 2, descriptive report on the different historic attributes and the different characterizations. And then to look at writing a scoping research statement on the different types of enclosure patterns to be found in the High Weald, and how those enclosure patterns relate to settlement, farm and farmstead development as well. So just to summarise, and if anybody wants to know a bit more about this, do come and ask me afterwards. This is just a summary of the attributes that we're looking at. So it will be looking at the sort of typology, identification of broad types, whether it's fields or woods or parkland, that sort of thing. Looking at then subtypes, so looking at the enclosure pattern in more detail, looking at whether the boundaries are sinuous or straight, their density, what sort of pattern it creates, whether it's a regular pattern or irregular pattern. Then looking at elements relating to place names as well, whether there's any historic place names associated with them. So this is all the present landscape, and then there are several layers within the data set to look at past land use as well. And all this is put onto GIS as a digital map using OS Master Map as the basis to actually capture the different shapes for the characterization. So this is just a summary of the data sources that we're using. As I said, we use Master Map as the baseline, with the OS Explorer map as background information, and then we're using aerial photographs, OS Epoch maps, that's the 25-inch, information from the Kent Historic Environment Record, for example, things like, is it a moated site, is there ironworks in the facility, that sort of thing. The Ordnance Surveyor's draft drawings, then geological maps, anything to do about the physical attributes, and then various other bits of background information, for example, Hasted's topographical history of Kent, and I think he's one of the first ones to actually start characterising parts of Kent and actually writing descriptions of the different parishes in an observational way. So this is just to run through some of the maps that were produced. This is the from the Kent Phase 1, looking at the broad types. So immediately you can see the rural nature of parishes, with the large blocks of woodland for Fedgebury and Hempstead, and then the areas of settlement in between. So this is the Phase 1, which is very much broad brush, and this is the first level. And then this is starting to look at it in more detail with the subtypes. Now, the two differences between the HLCs is that with the phase 1, all the historic attributes are in the description for each character area. So you can't really query it in much detail. Whereas with later HLCs, that the ability to describe and query the data is because the attributes are kept separately and stored in a different, in separate categories within the data set. So, for example, it will describe medium irregular asarts and copses with wavy boundaries. But in the second phase, we can actually, it's divided into size, so medium, shape, irregular, boundary typology. So you can then query on each of those. So that gives you a kind of impression of where you've got villages, settlement, with the different sorts of woodland, and the fields in between. And then this is the phase 2. This is the one we're looking at in a bit more detail. Again, the principle is the same. With a broad type level, we've got the fields, which is sort of the muddy brown colour, with the parkland. And immediately the difference between the two is that with phase 2, we're actually capturing settlement in more detail. We're capturing the distribution of the dispersed farmsteads and the changes within those farmsteads, where you've got quite a lot of design landscapes, where you've got farmsteads being converted into gardens and that sort of thing. So that's, a lot of that's being captured in this phase 2. And then this gives you, again, more at the next level down, the subtype level. And immediately you begin to see patterns coming out. So, for example, we've got these green and olive green colours of fields which are called asart fields. And for those that are not familiar with the term, it's where fields are carved out of woodland or out of waste, rather than actually realigned, laid out in an open type of landscape. So this is fields that have probably been carved out of woodlands. And so you've got fields where they're very, very irregular, which again is very typical of the high weald, and some which are quite so irregular. So we've got what we call aggregate asarts and cohesive asarts, and I'll explain a bit more about that a bit later on. So this is down in Hawkhurst, and stretching around Bedgebury Forest. But away up into Cranbrook and Goudhurst, heading towards the low weald, you've got a lot more landscape change coming on. So this is a landscape of antiquity, whereas this is a landscape of time depth, where you've got different layers of change. And the thing that really surprised me when I was doing this exercise is the impact of orchards in the 19th century, and how in the late 19th century and early 20th century, lots of new orchards were planted, the products were taken out on the trains, and then orchards were then removed in the late 20th century, and it's left a lot of these very large, big fields. And so you've got these large blocks of this sort of pale brown, which is what we call modern field amalgamation, where boundaries are being removed and fields are being rationalised. You can then look at the same data by looking at its period of origin of those different character types. So again, you pick out the medieval and the early medieval character types of origin. You can see these swathes of dark red, which is very characteristic of the ancient and antiquated type landscapes. You can then actually look at this in more detail with regard to past land use. And here, what I've done is I've pulled together all the layers that have origins of early medieval and up to the early post-medieval, so from, say, AD 450 up to 1700, to give you some idea of what the landscape might have looked like at that time. And again, you can see this very strong area around Hawkhurst, where the landscape was taken out of the forest, half from the forest, whereas up here you've got a landscape which probably has a much older settlement pattern, which might go back to pre-early Saxon, possibly into the Roman period, because you have again a lot of change taking place. 2 minutes. 2. Right. Taking this information, we can then pull out from their enclosures and overlay Bob's landscape farmstead character data, and we can then see that those areas of this dispersed pattern form, like we here, seems to correlate quite strongly with areas within the woodland origin farms fieldscapes. I'm just going to have to skip a few if it's going to be 2 minutes. How does this actually equate on the ground? If I just skip this. Take, for example, a little farmstead called Ellendon in Hawkhurst. This is Ellendon here, and it's got these fields which we call cohesive asarts, where they're fairly regular but still with their woody boundaries. But sitting next to it, you've got these fields which are far more irregular in pattern. This is what it looks like today, where you've got areas of various cohesive asarts, these are the asarts. This is the farmstead seen here on the edge, and an area where field boundaries have been rationalised. When you look back, you can see that this whole area looks to be carved from the woodlands. By comparison, this is in near Sissinghurst, Brandon. These are all medieval farmsteads. They've got medieval origins to them. This is an area where the field pattern has a much more what we call coaxial pattern, and it's hinged on this droveway running into the weald. And we've got what we call coaxial fields. This is how it looks like today. And this is how the survival of these coaxial fields, with this droveway along the ridge top, and this watercourse down the bottom here, and you've got the remains of a field system in the region here. So you begin to start reading the landscape, how it's evolved, and the farmstead sits on the spring line there. By contrast, around Bedford, you've got a meeting of several droveways, lathes and dens of the early medieval period, and on this site is Trenley, which was a manor belonging to the man of Wye. And here you've got this dip in the parish boundary at Cranbrook, which encapsulates this whole farmstead and den. And it sits here, and it's Assart Fields, and again it was carved from the woodlands, but this is actually a territorial boundary which follows an old stream course. So again, you're beginning to start to read how the landscape has evolved. This is Atwater Farm at Cranbrook, cohesive asarts, agricultural asarts, and you've got this later expansion into woodland. This is what they look like on the ground, wooded hedges, with its unimproved farmhouse. Just to go, that's the Kent Phase 1, and you can do a similar exercise with the farmsteads looking at dispersed driftway farms and what the type of field patterns they interact with. And it's mainly with sort of regular shaped fields associated with ponds, particularly in the low weald. Sorry, Nicola. Right, just to conclude, the historic relationship of the farm with its fields is probably still in fact. Understanding how field patterns have evolved will help in understanding how they were managed and organised by the farmsteads. HRC is a really good starting point to understand how the farm sits within its fields. They're probably sites are potentially much older than the oldest surviving buildings, so you've got a lot of archaeology sitting beneath them. And we don't have deserted farmsteads, not a frequent feature in the archaeological record for the weald. This is due in part to lack of field and archive research, but also that settlements have not moved around the landscape, but have evolved in close proximity to the present one. And I think this might be a really classic example of it. And they have a very high potential for below-ground archaeology. So 2 key issues. If I want you to go away today, I want there's 2 key issues to remember. Where below-ground works are proposed for historic farmsteads, I think it's important that an archaeological assessment and a watching brief is undertaken as part of those works to record how the farmstead was settlement. And where a historic farm is being converted to residential use, its relationship with the surrounding historic landscape should be retained through minimal use of barriers and screens and retention of historic boundaries in the historic field system. Thank you.